I won't go too much in terms of their circulatory system, but they do have a complete four-chambered heart, very, very much like other archosaurs. But, at this point in the lineage, we don't have that shunt that the crocodiles have, and their red blood cells are actually nucleated. Another really, really fascinating aspect of bird biology is their respiration. And this, again, is a bit ancestral to modern birds. If you remember from the tree in the beginning, having one-way flow of air is one of the synapomorphies of the archosaurs. But in birds, and probably in some of the dinosaurs, we don't have as much information about their lung structure, obviously, because it was soft tissue. But they really have taken this unidirectional flow in a fascinating direction. And, part of the fact is that it actually takes 2 inhalations and exhalations for a molecule of air to move through a bird. And it moves through both sacs that are have no gas exchange that happen. So these are the air sacs. And then it also moves through a lung, similar to our lung. And so when you think about bird breathing biology, you have to appreciate that they have air sacs. They usually have 9. Most of them are paired. So they're occurring in pairs, and they have a single one as well. In some locations, they have a trachea and they have a lung. And so air is going to come in, it's going to go into air sacs, it's going to go through the lung, go into air sacs, and then go out. And so you're never having air come directly into the lung, mixing with air directly coming out of the lung, as you do, say, in us, in mammals. And down here is shown the human alveoli, and you have incoming air mixing with outgoing air. And so that affects the gas concentrations. Instead, with birds, air is always going to come in and go through, actually deep in the lung, what are called air capillaries, which we don't have. And so we often think of capillaries like this, where blood is flowing and through really thin vessels. Well, they actually have those for air as well. So it's unique to birds. And so, this allows them to be much more efficient in extracting oxygen. Shown here, about 75% of the oxygen can be pulled out of air, breathed through, compared to only 20 with us. And this is absolutely critical for them to fly because it's a very aerobic endeavor, and they need high levels of oxygen. And so I just kind of wanted to briefly walk you through this, and I posted a couple videos online as well. So again, we're going to go through 2 circuits here. So we're going to go through circuit 1 and then circuit 2. And so basically in circuit 1, the bird breathes in and air moves in the trachea to the posterior sacs. Then when the air breathes out, when the bird breathes out, and so let me step back. When they breathe in, when they inhale, all of their air sacs expand. Okay, so both their posterior air sacs, their anterior air sacs expand. So on inhalation, these expand, and our little molecule of air here is going to move into a posterior air sac on the first inhalation. Then on the first exhalation, where all of the air sacs compress, the air that is in here is now going to move into the lungs on the first exhalation, which is shown here. So we have inspiration, expiration. So it's moved from the posterior air sacs into the lung. And now on the next inhalation, so even though new air is moving in here, the air we're following is moving from the air, the lungs, into the anterior air sacs. And then on the next exhalation, it's finally pushed out. So it basically moves into the posterior with inhalation, into the lungs with exhalation, into the anterior with inhalation, and then back out on the final exhalation. So it's a 2-cycle system. It moves through the air sacs, going to the posterior air sacs first, then the lungs, then the anterior, and then back out. There's no gas exchange that occurs in these air sacs. Instead, all of the vascularization and the air exchange with the blood, gas exchange with the blood, is happening in the lungs. So like ours, their lungs are highly vascularized, but they have good cross-current gas exchange in there. So it's not completely countercurrent, as we've seen in other biological situations, but it is cross current, which helps increase the gradient, so you maximize your exchange. And so shown here is both the blood that's going by and then the air that's going by. And so it's darker here for when it's carrying a lot of oxygen, and then as it's leaving, it's losing oxygen, and that oxygen is being picked up. And you can see the blood leaving is getting darker. So the blood comes in, it runs at kind of a 90-degree angle to these little air capillaries. So the air is able to move in these capillaries, and then you get exchange occurring, oxygen dropped off, and CO2 picked up. So, having these air capillaries is another unique adaptation of birds, which is likely, very common in the dinosaurs and the archosaur lines. Birds don't have diaphragms like us. Instead, a lot of their flappy movement aids in their breathing, and also movement of the furcula. If you remember, we were talking about the furcula and the wishbone before. So its movement when the wings are flapped helps compress and expand the lung and the air sacs. And so this really is just kind of like a big pump that moves air through the process. Some of these muscles are also attached to the eucynate process that birds have. If you remember, Tuatara had that as well. And this helps with the contraction and expansion of the lungs. So again, having a wishbone is an adaptation. Having this eucynate process is helpful as well. And if you think about it, it's very adaptive to have the movement of the wings helping with the breathing, because if you're flying for very long periods of time, it's not like you're going to stop and take a breath, right? But if your actual flapping aids in your breathing, that is kind of a win-win situation. The air sacs, which again, they're not, there's no gas exchange that goes on, but they can be really embedded deep in some of their pneumatic bones, are occasionally in some species adapted to other purposes. They can be for mate attraction. So like frigate birds have the ability to expand a very colorful air sac, and the females find this quite attractive. Also, some birds that do heavy diving use their air sacs as a cushion or kind of a pillow, so that when they're diving from deep, from the air at high speeds into the water, that helps reduce the blow when they enter the water. A couple other neat aspects about birds, are the fact that they've been so wildly successful at being able to live in all sorts of environments. You can live high in very cold regions, like the emperor penguins here. They can withstand wickedly cold temperatures, both by their body design. Their feathers are very insulatory. They can trap a lot of air under here. They also get, a bit chubby, as it were, and they use social behavior. They will huddle together to increase temperature. If you've never seen the video or movie March of the Penguins, it's really a treat to see, and it kind of talks about their biology of these interesting birds. Again, these are endotherms. They're largely homeothermic, other than some of the birds and hummingbirds. So they need to keep that high and constant body temperature. So insulation is very important to them. Be able to fly takes a lot of energy. So not only are you an endotherm, you're a flying endotherm. And so they have really high energy requirements, so they eat highly nutritious foods, nectar, which is basically pure sugar, seeds that have a lot of energy embedded in them. If you take a hummingbird and a lizard kind of the same size, the hummingbird's going to need about 20 times the calories a day than the lizard. And in fact, I've talked about torpor with these birds before, that they just can't stay active throughout the whole day. And so they'll often shut down overnight to save energy. So again, birds, can be found almost everywhere. They can be found deep in deserts, high in polar regions. They can travel between the two. They can migrate from one pole to another. The Arctic terns are just amazing migrators. They will travel, from breeding grounds to feeding grounds each year. thousands and thousands of miles over relatively short periods. And, you know, having the ability to fly, the ability to move around and find good food sources, have a highly insulated body, you know, so being endothermic allows you to go into some of these cold regions that ectotherms just wouldn't be able to survive in. In deserts, you know, where water is poor, being able to fly. There are doves that live in the desert that have to fly every day to a source of water, even if it's far from where they're say nesting. Their legs, even though they're largely exposed, they can have a nice countercurrent exchange system. So when they're hot, they can separate the blood flow coming out of the body from that returning, and they can dump heat, or when they're cold, they can shut these closer together, and it will help conserve heat in the body and kind of keep that in the upper regions. So you can have a body be very warm and a foot be very cold, and that's not going to kill the bird, because by the time the blood coming back from the foot reaches the bird, it's already warmed up to almost body temperature itself. And this is just kind of demonstrating the same thing. Sometimes you'll also have some species that live in very cold areas, like the ptarmigan, and they will have feathers on their feet. And you can see this bird has a very, very small exposed area. You know, very little of the beak is exposed, very little of the eye is exposed, heavily feathered, really thick plumage in the winter. And they could fluff this up to increase the air, so that keeps them warm, along with this countercurrent exchange that can go on. Birds, you know, if you ever watched a bird preening, they will reach back and they will kind of grab at something at the base of the tail, and then they will work through their feathers. This is preening is this behavior when they're fixing their feathers, kind of fixing the hooks and barbs. And they actually have a gland, the uropygeal gland, that is at the base of the tail, and it has a lot of oils that they will expose, especially the aquatic birds, and they will pick this up and work this through their feathers, and that helps make them more resistant to the environment. And you know, I just have a variety of birds shown here throughout the slides, but if you notice, these are little babies hitching a ride on Dad's back here, nestled in his feathers. Birds, kind of like snakes, are a bit unique in that they do have cranial kinesis. The bones of the beak actually are not highly fused to the skull, so they can work them kind of independently, and they can bend their bill up and down, not just opening it, but it can flex. And so this allows them a lot of maneuverability of their beak, especially if they're kind of a probing bird like this limpkin here. You know, it can kind of stick its beak down in, it can bend it, it can curl it up, or the spoonbills, which will filter feed. And like I mentioned before, you know, a lot of the diversity of birds comes in their feet and their beaks, and you can really look at their beaks and feet and know what they eat. So here's just kind of a representation of all sorts of different types of birds, you know, and you can look and see, you know, is their beak really square? Is it really pointy? You know, is it chiseled? Is it crossed? And this all depends on if they're, you know, opening up seeds. Are they probing deep in the water? If you've ever watched a flamingo eat, they actually turn their heads upside down and move their beak back and forth in the water. So that's supposed to be the eye. And so they will kind of tap their jaw open and shut, and they have little edges on their keratinous beak, and that allows them to filter feed, much like a whale can do, a baleen whale. You're obviously familiar with raptors and such, or big fruit. Also in the feet, you know, you remember I said there's 4 toes, but the orientation can vary. Sometimes you might have 3 forward and 1 back, or you might have 2 forward and 2 back. There's different ways of that. A zygodactyl is 2 forward and 2 back, so the foot, when they take a step, almost is in like an X pattern. The vast majority of birds, you know, we really haven't gone into diversity of birds. We do that more in the lab, but most birds are in a group called passerines, and these are perching birds, and these have 3 toes forward and 1 toe back with very large claws, and so they are well adapted to grab onto branches. Some of the ones that are, not really shown here, but, the hawks and stuff that will be picking up prey will have really large talons. The zygodactyl is found more in birds that are climbing trees. So if you have a tree, you have 2 toes forward and 2 toes back. And so it really helps you, parrots as well, to climb up on the trees, or like parrots to manipulate items. So they'll pick stuff up, pick it apart. And you see this also in owls. And then finally, I just want to talk a little bit about the physiology of birds. They have a flow-through digestive system, but if you look at it here, what is missing? If you said some sort of stomach, you get the golden ring. Remember, birds are all about flying. They can't carry weight. That's why they're not leg-bearing. That's why they have all these adaptations. They cannot carry big food loads. They really eat a little bit and then it just moves through. They do have a crop. They can pick up items on a short term, like they might be able to go and pick up some seeds, but then it will very quickly move through. They do not have a large stomach where a lot of food is sitting and being digested for a long period of time. Instead, especially the seed eaters will have various sizes of what's called the proventriculus and the gizzard. So again, the crop is for food storage. The proventriculus is what we kind of think of as the stomach, and this is where chemical digestion goes on. The gizzard is really what breaks things down. And I've mentioned before, birds can pick up stones and grit, and they will house this down in the gizzard, and so it can crush things, can crush seeds, crush almond, walnuts, all sorts of crazy stuff. Really strong contractile power. And if you ever have dissected an owl pellet, or like we did in lab, it has come from the gizzard. So the food item goes down into the gizzard, and then the bones and the fur and the stuff are kind of barfed back up and do not enter the more absorptive parts of the digestive system, which is not all shown here. Also not a huge intestine, although it differs a lot depending on the species. The cloaca, again, the common opening for the birds where they do reproduction, they also defecate and then they excrete here. It's capable of doing some water reabsorption. So most birds have a digestive system that looks like this. In the budgie, you have the esophagus, the crop for storing. This is also when birds are feeding the babies. They may house stuff here so they can barf it back up. Sometimes it can be kind of turned into what's called a crop milk, and it's more liquefied to some degree. And so there may be some, they might digest it a bit and then barf it back up and then give it to the babies. There is, however, one species of bird that is an herbivore or fullivorous, eating leaves. It's very, very rare, because to be able to eat vegetative material as a vertebrate, you have to be able to house microbes in your digestive tract to break down the chemical bonds that you find in plant materials. So the difference in these birds is they have an enormously large crop. They have a reduced proventriculus, a reduced gizzard, but they have this kind of front part of the gut, the foregut as we're going to call it, and we'll talk about this again with mammals, where there is microbial fermentation. So bacteria and other microbes are breaking down the food parts so that they can later be absorbed. But because they have this giant crop, these guys are not good flyers. They're very land-based birds, but really kind of unique in the bird world. And then finally, kind of again keeping with, it's all about flying. Birds don't have bladders. They poop pee all the time. I mean, probably all of you have been pooped on by a bird, although it's like poop pee. It's both the fecal output and the excretory product. They are very quick at their flow through. They have, urine concentrating tubules, very similar to mammals, high glomerular filtration. It's not quite as efficient, but again, they have no bladder. It is not good to have a lot of weight on board if you're trying to fly. So they don't store it, you know, they don't pee at certain times of day, they don't mark their territories really with poop pee. It's basically stuff is always moving through them. Food is moving through them. And so their excretory products and their fecal products are always coming out. You know, unlike us mammals who use urine for the most part, birds, like other, you know, in the reptile world, use uric acid. And so this is a highly concentrated excretory product. It's very good in that it's lightweight and it doesn't take a lot of water. So again, it's not as heavy. And you can see here, you know, it's about 3,000 times as concentrated as, you know, the combination in blood, meaning that the uric acid that is circulating in the blood gets even further concentrated as it comes out of the kidneys. And then compared to, say, the urea in mammals, it's about 25 times as concentrated as our pee. And one other issue birds deal with is trying to get rid of heavy salt loads. You know, we do it a lot through our excretion, but that wastes a lot of water. Birds often don't have a lot of water accessible, or they might actually be marine animals where there's a lot of water, but it's full of salt. How do you deal with this? You don't have fresh water. Well, these birds actually have very well-functioning salt glands, and they can actually drink seawater and excrete the salt through these salt glands. And so it's not like they're water stressed at sea, but unlike us, they can actually, you know, drink it. And even though the water is saltier than the body fluids, you know, they use these salt glands, and on most birds, they're located up here on the nose, especially in the seabirds. And you can actually see this. If you ever look at gulls, you might see some salt spray coming out of them. Same thing with some of the lizards, where you might see them shake their heads and fluid will come off of there. And that is the salt that they are excreting. So that is the end of our tour of bird biology.